Now, most of you know I'm not one for cold start videos, but I think this one here deserves some recognition because if it wasn't for the greenery you see here, you wouldn't be able to tell what time of year it is, because this thing starts exactly the same every single time, no matter how cold it is, how warm it is, or how long it's been sitting. So I can't really do a good in-depth video of it while it's sitting up against the wall here. So let's get it started up and we'll move it out into the open. So today is Memorial Day, May 29th, and I feel that it's important that I start off this video by saying that we need to just take a little bit of time today to sit back and reflect on what we have here living in the United States, the freedoms that we've been given, that many men and women over the years have paid the ultimate sacrifice for, to keep that flag flying high. And I feel like in this day and age, a lot of us have lost track of how fortunate we really are to live in this great country and to celebrate the many freedoms that we take for granted each day. Because, I mean, you just look, not that I encourage people to watch the news, but if you do watch the news, if you turn on the news, you'll always hear about turmoil going on in other countries. And at the end of the day, I think it really makes you feel proud, or, appreciate what we have living in this country. And that's all thanks to the sacrifices of the men and women who have fought for us, past and present, and especially on this day, those who never did make it home. And we pray for them and we keep them in our hearts all the time, and we're very thankful for the sacrifices that they made. So while everybody may be out celebrating or partying or going to the beach this weekend, just take a little time to reflect and remember why we're really here and why we're really able to celebrate this day off and this start to the summer season. So it dawned on me that I'm coming up on about a year of owning this machine, and I never really did a good video on it. And this is my trusty steed here. This is my loyal companion, my load lifter, my weight mover, my shovel, and my tank. It does a lot of the chores around here. Even though I live on a 1/4 acre, I feel like you can never have too small of a property to have a decent loader tractor to help you out. And this is kind of my MVP around here, so I think it's going to get a video for all respect that I owe it. So this is my 1984 Ford 340A industrial tractor, or skip loader, which is actually the proper term. Not skid loader, but skip loader. I think that term has kind of been lost to time. But a skip loader back in the day, 70s and 80s, was basically the definition of a tractor backhoe loader that has had the backhoe removed. You don't really see these too much anymore. I mean, there's still a handful of landscapers and farmers that may use them. But back in the 70s and 80s, before skid steers and the compact tractor market had really taken off and they'd really advanced in terms of technology, skip loaders like this one here were marketed to a lot of commercial contractors and landscapers who needed something to do a lot of heavy lifting. And basically it was designed to serve the purpose of a tractor or a backhoe if needed. They were sold with and without backhoes in some cases. Another term is industrial tractor, like I said. I think that's more commonly heard. But back in the 70s and 80s, skid steers weren't really much more capable than a garden tractor loader, or a shovel for that matter. And compact tractors had just started making their way over from Japan, so there wasn't a huge market for them yet. And brands like John Deere and International Harvester were still trying to get their compact lines off the ground. So for the commercial contractors and landscapers and whatnot, and even construction crews, they've often tended to lean towards a skip loader for doing a lot of grading and light material moving on job sites. And like I said, back in the 80s especially, these were very common, and there's still a handful of them in use out there, but I think a lot of them have served their purpose. And the problem with these tractors is that since they were usually owned by commercial fleets, a lot of them took a severe beating I mean, you get a crew of, 4 or 5 different people jumping on and off the machine over the course of a day's work, and it takes a toll on them. And I won't say that this one here is a gem. I mean, you can just take a quick glance at it, you can see it's a little it's a little rough, no doubt about it, but it's not to be unexpected for a machine that's 40 years old. And of course, being a Ford, I mean, I've preached about them before in my my past videos. I have a soft spot for these because I grew up riding on a couple of Ford skip loader tractors. My uncle, who was a landscaper for many years, started out in the early 1980s, and one of the first pieces of equipment he bought was a skip loader, because they were commonplace back then. And at the time, he bought a Ford 340B, which is the newer version of this tractor here. So the 340A was made from 1979 to 1984, I believe, and then they switched to the 340B, and likewise the 540A became the 540B, and so on and so forth. And my uncle bought a 340B, ran it for a couple years, and then decided to trade it in on a 445A to get the 4-wheel drive, and never looked back once he had 4-wheel drive. And he had 2 445As for many years. I remember riding on them as a little kid. Spent a lot of hours with them on job sites and just kind of running around the farm with them. And then when I was about 8 years old, he bought a 445D, which was a little bit newer, had a little bit more power, and that tractor he's probably going to take to the grave with him, if I'm being honest. But I've seen, having grown up with these things, seeing them in, on job sites and being used in many different applications, I've kind of witnessed firsthand just how tough these things really are. And a lot of people, if you ask around, you read on forums and whatnot, and you ask some old farmers, a lot of people will tell you that these old Fords were some of the toughest tractors built. I mean, there were a lot of good brands of equipment back then, but I think as far as small utility tractors go, Fords were probably the toughest. They seem to take a beating better than most other brands. And even though Ford has been out of the ag game for over 20 years now, parts are still pretty, for the most part, pretty easy to get for them. And they, especially these skip loaders, they actually shared a lot of components with the ag line, like the common 3000, 4000, 4600, and so on and so forth. So if you're looking for something that's simple but reliable, and you don't want to spend a whole lot of money, a Ford utility tractor like this can be bought for not a whole lot of dime. I bought this machine off of a horse farmer down in Chester County, Pennsylvania, last summer, and he mostly just used it to do a little bit of light material moving and pull a 6-foot brush hog around his property, like mowing around his fence lines and stuff. And he was not the original owner. This tractor, as far as I can tell, came from a commercial fleet, because the guy I bought it from purchased it from a Ritchie Bros auction down in Maryland about 15 years before. So that's the Ritchie Brothers should be enough of an indication that this thing lived a hard life, because a lot of the stuff that gets taken to auction there is usually rode hard and put away wet. And I mean, I won't lie, this tractor is no exception, but for the kind of deal that he gave me on this tractor, it was just, I think it was meant to be. And for what I paid for this thing, you can't even find a decent garden tractor loader. I think, in my opinion, for what people ask for loaders for their garden tractors, it's just, for what they're worth, you might as well just get something a little bit bigger. I mean, it's kind of common sense if you ask me. That's not to put down anybody that has loaders on their tractors, because I know plenty of guys that have garden tractor loaders, but for what it's worth, I think this is a lot more useful, and it's a lot heavier built. So if you're not familiar with the genealogy of the Ford tractor line, I'll give you a little bit of background here. So in 1965, Ford came out with the new and improved 1000 series family, I guess you could say, which was the 2000, 3000, 4000, and so on. The 3-cylinder versions. The previous generation were 4-cylinder, and they were based off of the old style, like the 801, the 800, the 801 series tractors. They carried that platform for quite a few years. And then in 1965, they updated, and they carried this design that you see here pretty much up until the end of the Ford Ag line in the early 2000s, after the New Holland merger. They kept the same basic platform on all of their utility tractors under like 70-ish horsepower, and it really proved itself, because I mean, the numbers of these tractors with this design that you see here, I mean, there's so many of them still out there running around today on different farms and in different applications. And when they first came out in 1965, the 3000 and 4000 were probably the biggest sellers out of the lineup, and those were the agricultural models. And then they had a, I guess Ford classified it as a utility, not a true industrial, but like a utility, which was a little bit heavier duty than the ag model. That was the 3400 and the 4400. And the way to tell those apart, I mean, aside from the yellow paint, is that those models would have had, instead of the adjustable square tube front axle that you'd find on a 3000 or 4000, the 3400 or 4400 would have had a curved, like an arched cast iron single piece front axle with a heavier kingpin setup. And they used the same steering mechanism, which was a series of tie rods and radius rods that ran, you know, along the length of the frame on both sides. They had a mechanical steering box mounted underneath the dash, and then that operated basically a very crude power assist steering system. And like I said, it used a system of tie rods and radius rods that worked okay when they were new, but once you got some hours on the machine, the ball joints would wear out, and then you'd have to replace them. And in this day and age, you can't find, you know, OEM replacement ball joints for them anymore. I think guys have said you have to cut when the ball joints wear out, you have to cut them off and weld new ones in. I've never worked on one myself, so I can't confirm, but I know that the steering linkages on them are, you know, when they wear out, they get to be expensive real quick. And a few of the tractors that I looked at before this one had that same steering setup on it, and I noticed that seemed to be the biggest wear item on every one of them, because I looked at a handful of tractors before I settled on this one here. Eventually they did away with that power assist steering setup, and they went to a solid, or I should say welded front axle here that you see on this model, and they went to true hydrostatic power steering instead of the power assist setup, and that, I think that worked much better. But like I said, the 3400 and 4400 were kind of like the medium duty utility models. They had that arched front axle, and then the 3500 and 4500 were the heavy duty industrial models, the true industrials that were sold with or without a backhoe. Those had a solid front axle, kind of like this one that you see here, a straight axle. They had heavier kingpins, and there were a couple of other minute differences. I think those were built a little bit heavier in general, and as far as parts compatibility, I'm not sure what else was all different between them, but there are a lot of those tractors running around still. They had that yellow paint and blue decals, and some of them I think had a blue undercarriage as well. And like I said, there's plenty of those running around as well. But those were made up until the mid-70s, and then they came out with some new model numbers. So the 3400 and 4400 kind of merged into the 335, and then the 3500 and 4500 sort of kind of merged into the 445. So you had the 335 and then the 445, and the 445 I believe was the first one to be offered with four-wheel drive as well. And then in the late 70s they had a 340 also, which was a kind of in between 335 and 445. They had what was interesting about those was they had the heavier rear end out of a 4000 series or like a 4500, but they had the smaller engine from a 3000 series or 3500. So they were kind of like a half breed between the two. And those, the original 340s had that old style power assist steering setup, which, you know, there's videos out there on YouTube, guys that aren't happy with them. For a big heavy industrial tractor, it just, you know, more moving parts, especially in a steering setup on a tractor like this that's designed to carry a lot of weight on the front end with the loader. That steering setup just wouldn't last. A lot of parts that would wear out and need to be replaced. So the 340, the original 340, had a pretty short production run, and in 1979 I believe they replaced it with the 340A, which you see here. And there they had made quite a few improvements, you know, including, like I said before, the front axle, and they switched to the hydrostatic steering setup, which is kind of like you'd see on one of our garden tractors. They have your orbital valve under the steering column, and then a bunch of hoses running up to the front there to the cylinder. And I think overall that proved to be a much better setup. So the 340A had a production run of about 5 or 6 years, and then it was replaced by the 340B, which, to my understanding, the only difference between the two is that the 340B had a synchronized transmission, so you could actually shift gears while moving. This tractor shares the same 175 cubic inch naturally aspirated 3-cylinder diesel engine as the older 3000. This same basic 3-cylinder engine design was carried all the way up into the 90s and early 2000s, like I said. There is a 175 cubic inch version. This one puts out about 47 horsepower. Then there was the 201 cubic inch version that was used in the 4000 and the models that came after it. And those put out somewhere around 52 to 55 horsepower, I think. And then later on, like towards the end of the production, they put out as much as 60 to 62 horsepower. I know the version that's in my uncle's 445D puts out about 62 horsepower. But like I said, this same basic design was carried from 1965 all the way up until the late 90s, early 2000s. And I got to say, these are just about bulletproof engines. You know, they're a torque monster. They're kind of primitive. They have the old style, rotary pump, which I think was actually made in Britain, if I'm not mistaken. And they're fairly simple. I don't think these are sleeved engines. They're parent bores, so when you rebuild them, you got to put sleeves in them. But these things put out a lot of torque. I'd be curious to see how much torque they're rated to make, but these things are known to take quite a beating. Now this one, you can see has some blue ag paint, so I'm not sure if this is the original engine to this tractor. Of course, like I said, having come from a Ritchie Bros auction, it was most likely owned by a contractor fleet for many years, so it wouldn't surprise me if they did wear the original engine out and put another one in it. But I have seen these things still going with tens of thousands of hours on them. The problem is, with these tractors, the gauge clusters were so poorly made that they fogged up or they quit working prematurely. So it's very, very rare that you see one that still has a working hour meter on it. And I know you can't really see it there, but the hour meter on this one shows just over 6,000 hours, and I know that's not accurate because it hasn't changed in all the time that I've had this tractor. And it just makes you wonder how many hours are really on this thing. And when you have something like this that came out of a contractor fleet, you never really know. But I know my uncle pushed his tractors to well over the 10,000 hour mark before either one of them really needed a rebuild. But this thing especially, I keep it parked behind my shop building here, and it doesn't matter how warm or how cold it is outside or how long this thing has been sitting. As long as you got fuel in it and you have a good battery, that thing will fire right up in the first couple revolutions, just like you saw. Just another brief look at the engine from this side. I can't really show you much because the muffler is in the way. I'd have to take the muffler off to open this side of the hood, but there's your exhaust manifold. These were available with an updraft, vertical exhaust, or a downdraft orchard exhaust. And my Ford 4000 that my grandfather originally owned has the downdraft exhaust. I think those are probably harder to find, but nonetheless, you can see, here's just another look at this side of the engine. Again, the blue paint showing through, and it looks like they kept the original cast iron oil pan. Again, that was one of the things that separated the ag version from the industrial version, was that cast iron oil pan. Because if you're doing brush hogging or whatnot, you're better off having a cast iron oil pan in case something comes up through that would probably puncture a steel oil pan. And then another look at the front bolster here. This is much, much heavier duty than what you would see on an equivalent 3000 or 4000 tractor. And the front axle as well. That's one thing that sets it apart. I just noticed this bolt's missing here from the front bolster. It looks like that, or from the front pivot, I should say. It looks like that may have sheared off. So that's a little bit questionable. I'll have to give that some attention. Another thing that sets apart the industrial tractors from their ag counterparts is the hydraulic pump. So this tractor uses a Ford Model 745 loader, which is a little bit heavier duty, a little bit stronger than what was offered for the agricultural models. Actually a lot stronger than what was offered for the ag models. And part of the reason for that was because these used a separate hydraulic pump, which was mounted up here below the engine. I don't know offhand the specs of this pump, how capable it is or how much it can put out, but I've lifted heavy loads with this thing with the engine idling, and I mean, if that's not a testament to how much torque that little 3-cylinder engine makes, I don't know what is. A couple years ago, when I was still living at my parents' house in New Jersey, my old F-150 jumped out of park and it rolled down the hill off the driveway into the lane, crashed into a tree. and we used my uncle's 445D to pull it out, and we hooked the chain up to the bucket, and he left the thing idling, and we just walked the truck right out of the ditch with the engine idling. He never even had to touch the throttle. So if that's, I mean, that should give you a good indication of how much torque that engine makes and how powerful those little hydraulic pumps are. Much more capable for lifting heavy loads, especially if like for a landscaper, if you're lifting a pallet of, you know, sod or lifting pavers or whatnot. Typically these tractors lifted and moved much heavier loads than an agricultural tractor would have. So that's another nice thing about these industrial tractors. The loaders are a lot stronger. Now the 745 loaders, on the, especially on like the 335, the 340A, 340B, and so on, they did have one major flaw that I feel I need to discuss, and you probably already noticed it, but the loader frames would break right in here where this cross member is welded in. And I think that's because the material that they used in this section, this front part of the boom, was just a little too short. If they had used a little bit of a wider piece of steel, it probably would have fixed the problem. But they always broke the welds right up on the inside here. You can see where this has been welded by some handyman, and by that I mean Stevie Wonder. And then they also broke the welds up in here, right below, or right above where the cylinder mounts, and you can see there's actually some cracking there, so I'm going to weld that up. That was a common flaw with this particular model of loader. On the bigger models like the 445, they used a slightly larger and heavier duty loader that had bigger arms, and the cracking was never an issue, and because of that they could support a bigger bucket as well. But I wouldn't want to put a bigger bucket than this one on this particular loader here. And like I said, you can see this one's been broken and welded and patched several times. I guess somebody thought they were a handyman. And we shouldn't have any more breakage issues with it from here on out, but it would have been nice if they at least cared to use the right color yellow. It looks like John Deere yellow that they used. I do have some Ford Industrial yellow in the shop there, so at some point I'm going to sand this all down and repaint it to make it look at least halfway decent. But if you're ever looking for a Ford Industrial tractor, if you're ever looking at one of these to buy, pay attention to the center section where the cross members welded in, because they very frequently broke there. At some point, I mean, you can see this bucket here is pretty worn. It's got some holes in it. It's got some rust pitting and a little bit of Swiss cheese too. At some point I would like to switch this bucket out for a skid steer quick attach style. That way I can put pallet forks on the front of it. But like I said, the skid steer quick attach hadn't become a thing until more recently, so it just wasn't a thought back when these tractors were made. But definitely worth the investment. I can get a coupler through work, and I can get a set of pallet forks through work, so I may look into that here in the future. And you can see, I mean, it's like I said before, this tractor is not a gem by any means. It does need a bit of work, but for what I'm using it for, it's, you know, it served me really well. I'll just replace the, you know, the seals like in the cylinder here. I'll replace the seals and replace the hoses as they go. It's nothing too urgent right now. Like I said, I'm not using this thing for 8 or 10 hours a day. I'm only using it, you know, just to move stuff in and out of the shop here and do some heavy lifting. So I'm not too concerned. But you know, this tractor served somebody well for many, many years, and it's served me just as well, even in its old age. As worn and, you know, tired as it is, you know, it's never let me down. One thing I like about the 745 loader, especially on these later models, is they switch from the older style 2 remotes to just a single joystick to control the loader. Just a little more convenient than having 2 levers to mess with. Now this one, given the hours on the machine, it does have a lot of slop in it, and you'll notice sometimes if I'm running the loader, you'll notice sometimes it'll drift or it'll stick. It's just a matter of replacing some of these pins and bushings and whatnot. Not the end of the world, but that single joystick is a lot more convenient to have than the old style 2 remote. I got used to that on the 445A, so I preferred to have a tractor of my own that had the same single joystick setup. If you hadn't noticed it already, somebody in the past replaced the original front wheels with these aftermarket ones that are painted silver. Looks like they're dated February of 2018, so they're actually fairly new. I can't help but wonder what happened to the original wheels and tires that made them have to replace the wheel too. But nonetheless, I mean, a little bit of paint would fix that right up. And it looks like when the original left front tire wore out. They replaced it with a truck tire, which is kind of funny. I got to give them an A for creativity anyway. But when this tire does eventually wear completely out, I'm just going to replace it with another Michelin like it's got on the right hand side. This is what the tractor actually should have here. These industrial tractors use this type of tire as opposed to the 3-rib, your standard tractor tire. So at some point, once that left front tire does finally wear out, it'll get replaced. If we come around to the back of the tractor here, you'll see it's got Firestone 16 9x24 tires on it with 2 sets of the heavy wheel weights. As heavy as these tractors are in the rear, I found that you can never have too much weight, because for what I'm using it for, I mean, moving that 60 carcass in and out of this building here, I did lift the back end of that tractor off the ground a couple times. So even with 2 sets of wheel weights, sometimes I feel like it may not be quite enough. Like I said before, the 340A has the heavier duty rear end that would have been the same as like a 4000 or a 4600. So it's definitely got weight to it in the rear end. But like I said, I don't think you can ever have too much weight. This has a 3-point hitch, as you can see. It looks like somebody cobbled together some pieces off of another tractor, because most of the original adjustable linkage is gone. It also has 540 rear PTO. The shield is gone and the drawbar is gone. The previous owner was pulling a 6-foot brush hog with it, so the PTO was getting used. I know it does work. I have this little A-frame adapter on it here in case I ever need to put a ball hitch on it to move my trailer around, because in this little confined space here, it can be a little difficult, so it's nice to have something to use other than my truck. This tractor did have a ROPS on it when I purchased it, but I had to take the ROPS off in order to get the machine to fit underneath my 7-foot bay doors, as you can see here. I would much rather have a ROPS on this tractor. I like the way they look, and obviously they serve an important function, but for what I was doing, it just had to go. Now, the problem with taking the ROPS off is that the ROPS also serves as the base or the mount for the fenders, and it also helps to sandwich the it works with the lower loader frame to sandwich the rear axle. So when I took the ROPS off, when I pulled these 4 bolts out on each side, the loader frame was just kind of hanging down, and there was no way to secure the fenders. So I had a local machine shop cut me a piece of 1.5-inch thick steel plate, and I got some grade 8 bolts and just ran them up in there, and now it's mounted up, and the fenders actually have something to mount to. So it almost looks factory. I mean, if I had painted it, you probably wouldn't be able to tell. I'd imagine that if you ordered one of these tractors new without a ROPS, it probably would have come with a similar design there. But got to have that there, because otherwise the loader frame would just be hanging down. And you'll see typically these tractors had lights mounted on the loader uprights. Somebody took those off at some point in the past. The rear flashers are still there, but the wiring to them has been cut, and God knows how long it's been since they were last used. But going down the road, this tractor kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. So I've been, so far I've been pretty lucky, but I probably will end up fixing the lighting at some point. You also see it still has what's left of the original seat pan. When I got this tractor, it actually had a cushion from a Toro lawnmower or lawn tractor seat on it. I got rid of that pretty quick. At some point, I'll probably put an aftermarket Tractor Supply seat on it. But for right now, for the little that I'm using this tractor just around the yard here and back and forth in and out of the building, this doesn't really bother me. If I was using it for an extended period of time, though, that would be a different story. I filled this tractor up back in July of last year, right after I bought it. I drove it to the truck stop up the road here and filled it up. And I still have not had to top the fuel off since then. We're going on almost a year, and I've put probably 15 hours or 20 hours on this tractor since then. Now, granted, that wasn't, those hours weren't spent doing any hard pulling, but, it's a lot of idle time, a lot of moving back and forth and whatnot. And I've hauled a few loads of compost to the neighbor's farm down the road here with it. So, a lot of running up and down the roads with it too. And still haven't had to top the fuel off. So I guess you could say that's another selling point for these little 3-cylinders. So now here's a view of the operator station. This is a view that I am very, very familiar with, because I spent many, many hours riding on my uncle's lap, on his 445 tractors as a little kid. And this is pretty much the same view that I remember, except the hood was just a little bit longer on the 445. But this same basic, sheet metal and dash design was carried all the way up into the early 2000s on the Ford utility tractors. It's kind of a, looking out over a hood like this was a staple of my childhood. But it's a pretty basic operator station, no frills. This tractor is equipped with the 6 and 4 manual reversing transmission. With these tractors, you could order the 6 and 4 transmission. You could order a 4-speed shuttle shift, which was basically just a single stick with four gears, and then your shuttle was up here on the dash. And then in the later models, they went to an electric over hydraulic shuttle, which was like basically a lever with a switch that you could flip forward and back. But on these tractors, if you ordered a shuttle shift, you could not order a rear PTO. Those two didn't become an option together until I think the 345D and 445D came out in the 90s. So, like I said, if you wanted a PTO on a tractor, you had to order just one of the standard transmissions. And I think this one here, the 6 and 4 manual reversing transmission, is probably the best as far as speed choices, and it's about as close as you'd get to a shuttle shift. I have seen a couple of these tractors with a shuttle shift transmission, but they're few and far in between, and they use a torque converter that's very expensive to rebuild when they wear out. One of the tractors I looked at before I bought this one was a 535, which had a torque converter transmission, and the torque converter was bad, so you'd have to shift it into gear while you were turning the key to start it up. So basically you had to shut it off every time you wanted to shift between forward and reverse, or you wanted to shift between gears. And at that point I realized it was probably more of a headache than I should have considered. So I decided to look for a 6 and 4 manual reversing transmission instead. And this is a good transmission for loader work, because you basically have, basically what it is a 3-speed with high and low. So you have second gear, first gear, and then third gear. And then first and second gear each have a matching reverse gear if you pull the shifter down. So you have second forward, second reverse, first forward, first reverse, and then third, which is forward only. And then of course you have your low and your high shifter. I usually, just moving it around the yard here, I usually just keep it in low range. Now I know you're wondering why I have a 50 horsepower industrial tractor with a loader here from my quarter acre of a property that I live on. But I mentioned before, the reason I needed a tractor like this was to move my heavy projects in and out of my little shop building here, which has a 7-foot tall garage door. And I don't know if you've ever had to move a John Deere 60, especially a dead one, but a basic 60 tractor weighs around 5,500 pounds or so. And then this one here also happened to have the wide front axle and the extra long rear axles, which means it has a heavier carrier, and it has the heavier cast iron dished wheels as well. So this tractor altogether probably weighs close to about 6,000 pounds, and a little compact tractor with a loader is not going to have enough balls to move that thing around. We loaded it up on my trailer to haul it up here with the two 445s, as you guys saw in my one YouTube video, and even that proved to be a little bit of a challenge for both of those tractors. So I knew I was going to need something heavy and with a lot of guts to unload it and to just move it in and out of the building here. You're probably wondering why I didn't purchase a skid steer. The reason for that is because, well, for one, skid steers are just way too expensive for what I'm looking to do. To purchase a good skid steer that has a high capacity hydraulic pump, or high flow hydraulics, I guess I should say, and that actually has a good bit of weight to it, you're easily looking at 30 or 40,000 used. I don't have that kind of budget, and I'm not a commercial guy, so I can't justify spending that kind of money. And again, a little compact tractor with a loader just wouldn't have enough guts, especially a Hydra would not have enough guts to move that thing in and out unless it was completely stripped. So to move that whole 6,000 pound hunk of iron, I needed something with balls. And after seeing, like I said, after seeing what these little old Ford utilities are capable of, I just had to have one myself. That's what I grew up with, and that's what I know and love. Dual brakes, obviously. The brakes, I think, were done fairly recently because they work really well. This is your parking brake latch right here, but for some reason it doesn't really latch very well. It locks the left brake, but not the right. So that probably needs to be adjusted. And this one also does have the luxury of a foot throttle, which is very nice to have. I looked at a 335 that I actually posted a YouTube video of here about a year ago that did not have a foot throttle. And for doing loader work, I think a foot throttle is so much better because you need your right hand to operate the loader joystick. And the last thing you want to have to do is to switch back and forth between your joystick and your hand throttle right here. So that's where having a foot throttle comes in handy. No pun intended. This also, obviously having a 3-point hitch, it does have draft control. Nothing Nothing too crazy there. It has a toolbox on the left side. The previous owner left me a bunch of goodies in here. So, you know, typical farm tractor, you never know what you might need when you're out on the job or you're out in the field somewhere. And your Pto engagement is actually down here next to the clutch pedal. I've never used the Pto because I don't have any Pto attachments for it. And then your differential lock is down there on the floor. So, same, like I said, same basic layout that they used on all the Ford utility tractors after 1965. And then originally this would have had a fuel shutoff cable that came out right here. I guess the original one broke and some cheapskate put this one in here. They drilled another hole in the bottom of the dash here. I mean, it works. I'm not complaining, but it's not factory. And like I said, the none of the lights are intact still, and 2 of them are missing. So I do have the original light switch here, but that's not really serving a purpose. So I know you already saw me start it up here at the beginning of the video, but let's do it again. I'll give you a good walk around, and we'll drive it a little bit. I'm telling you, it starts that easy every single time. I have never had a problem starting this thing, even in the dead of winter. Now, I did have to put a new battery in it when I first got it, because the battery that was in it was an AutoZone battery and it was junk. But I'll tell you what, with even a half-decent battery, it doesn't take much to start these things up. Just listen to this thing here for a minute. Got a little bit of a leak there at the fuel filter housing, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. Wide open throttle right there. That's the sound of my childhood right there. How's that for down pressure? Yeah, pretty strong for what it is. Let's take it for a quick spin down the driveway here. If I can not grind gears, that would be helpful. The engine's not too far off of an idle, and you can see how good we're moving here. I would love to put a plow behind this thing, like a 2 or 3 bottom plow, and just see what it does. And like I said, I've had this thing up and down the main road a handful of times, just moving compost and hauling stuff around, hauling debris. And it gets up and goes pretty good. As to be expected, the steering's got a little bit of slop in it, but for the hours, I can't really complain. Beautiful day in Amish country, by the way. Stuck in reverse. Let's try third. Clutch has a little bit of wear. It doesn't really grab until the pedal's almost completely up. She gets up and goes, like I said. I'll show you low range here real quick. Let's do low first. Where I come from, this is cultivating or transplanting speed. Third gear low range is usually what I use for putzing around the property here. It's nice having a matched reverse gear for your first and second gears and forward. And then just real quick here, I'll show you why I bought this thing. Fits like a glove. So if I need to come in here to move the 60, it fits right underneath. The problem with a skid steer is I can probably pull it in here forward, but you can't see behind you, so you don't have a whole lot of room to turn. So there you have it, guys. That's a walk around and in-depth review of my 1984 Ford 340A industrial tractor, or skip loader. Or I should say my trusty companion. And I'm not really going to have many videos showing this thing off. It's not really a show tractor. I mean, I've had it over a rough and tumble, but it's not really much of a show tractor. And obviously I don't have any land. I wish I could say that all these fields back here were mine, but they're not. I just live on this little quarter acre here. So for right now, it'll serve me just fine moving my 60 project in and out of the building. I can, chain it up to the bucket, and I'll use it to hang parts for paint and whatnot, or sandblasting. It should serve me just fine for that. I also thought about maybe using this tractor for snow removal, just up and down the driveway here. But we don't get the snowstorms that we used to, and I think we all know a two-wheel drive tractor isn't exactly great in the snow. So I don't know, we'll see. But for the time being, it'll serve me just fine moving from that point there to right around the corner. So and I've run it up and down the roads here a little bit too, so I don't know, maybe if I have it out on the road one day, I'll take a video of that. But like I said, it'll serve me just fine for what I need. And you know, I grew up around these old Ford Industrials, and you know, I am sold on their quality and dependability, so I just had to have one for myself. That sound is a staple of my childhood. So I know several of guys who hate Ford trucks and Ford vehicles, but they will use a Ford tractor any day of the week. So I mean, that's a testament to how well they were built. And if you haven't had the chance to own one of these or run one of these, I highly recommend it. I sell compact tractors for a living, and I think I would still rather have one of these for utility work. They're just built really well and very dependable. So if you don't have a Ford loader tractor, get yourself one. But anyway, this should be enough for this video here, and this tractor should be enough to serve me for the next couple years living at this place until I can settle down somewhere with more land, and then maybe I can get a plow to put behind it or something and do some real farm work with it. But nonetheless, hopefully this will hold you guys off for a little while. So thanks for watching, and happy Memorial Day, and thank you to all those who have served this country and gave their lives, paid the ultimate price. We are truly grateful for your sacrifice, and it's because of that that we're able to live in a great country where we're able to use Ford tractors and equipment. So thanks for watching, guys, and have a great day.